Today's video is a continuation of this one from Tuesday, but no worries if you haven't seen that one yet. In that video, I cover the various goals of the participants and great powers during the Crimean War. One of the proposals covered was that of Lord Palmerston, British Foreign Secretary turned Prime Minister. Palmerston seemed convinced of the greatness of Britain and of Britain's ability to do basically anything due to their naval supremacy. Any nation threatening British hegemony, aka Russia in this case, should be dealt with. Specifically, Russia had been creeping into Central Asia. Should this not be stopped, they may soon be in a position to threaten British India. That was already concerning enough, but the present Crimean War could put Russia in a position to reach the Mediterranean as well, threatening British hegemony over the sea. For Palmerston, the Crimean War was the opportunity to destroy Russia as a threat. So, if everything went perfect for Palmerston, he would expand the anti-Russian coalition with Sweden, Norway, Prussia, and most notably, Austria. Basically, most of Europe would be against Russia, meaning Russia's coffers would soon be exhausted, and any attempt at a long-term war would be futile, eventually leading Russia to surrender unconditionally. The peace deal would then look something like this. The Swedes would get Finland, likely as a personal union, so Finland retains the autonomy they had under the Russians. This would then be combined with a major Prussian expansion along the Baltics, ruining Russian power projection into that sea. Next up, an independent Kingdom of France would be created, likely under French protection, to save it from the other great powers. Austria then, despite joining the Allies, would have to give up on their Italian holdings, with at least Lombardia likely going to Sardinia, and Venice probably being under their influence too. To convince Austria to let go of these territories, Romania would be theirs, turning them into a buffer between the Turks and the Russians. Finally, the Ottomans would annex Crimea, destroying Russia's Black Sea capabilities, while gaining back influence over the Caucasus states. And there you have it. On the surface, this may seem like a pretty decent peace deal, preventing the rise of Russia, but I hope that by the end of this video, you agree with me that it is pretty short-sighted and will probably ruin the balance of power in Europe. Before that though, there is also the matter that none of the great powers would even agree to this treaty, though I already explored that in the previous video. To quickly recap some of the biggest points, the existence of an independent Poland is unacceptable to Austria and Prussia. Gaining Finland would force Sweden to break neutrality, as Russia will want to get it back. Sweden probably doesn't want to do this. The Ottoman gains are very difficult to defend and will immediately fall to Russia in a follow-up war, and the northern Italian territories were some of Austria's richest holdings. They certainly won't give them up after winning a war. But realism aside, this is the peace deal that the great powers, for some reason, agreed to. What might happen next? Well, let's look at Italy first. Desire for unification had been rising steadily for the past few decades. Yet, the watchful eye of the Austrians had always prevented this. Sardinia-Piedmont had attempted to position themselves as the unification candidate, but without a weakened Austria, they simply couldn't. But now, not only was Austria thrown out of northern Italy, Sardinia had grown multiple times more powerful than before. The other minor Italian states, very much under Austria's influence, would now come without direct Austrian protection. You can bet that within a couple of years, with the tacit approval of the British and perhaps the French, the Sardinians managed to subsume these states into their sphere of influence. Even better, because Sardinia didn't need France to beat the Austrians in a war, they also don't have to give up their western territories in exchange for unification. From this position, you can bet that before 1860, Italy is pretty much fully unified, except for Rome, which is still defended by French soldiers. Now Palmerston is not stupid. This is pretty much exactly what he hoped to accomplish. This new, strong Italian state could be used by Britain against potential Austrian or French desires for expansion. or perhaps even directed into the Balkan to function as a foil for the rise of the southern Slavs under Russia's influence. But while Britain may be happy, both France and Austria hate this development. Napoleon III, because a strong Italian state cannot be influenced by him, and he gained nothing by its creation, not even prestige. Austria's disdain was even more concrete. Not only did they lose their own influence in Italy, many in the new state were already suggesting that reunification wasn't quite finished yet. I'm sorry for the quick intermission, but by far most of you aren't subscribed. To keep up to date with all my releases, consider doing so. Thank you. Alright, so that was crisis number 1, but this one was likely anticipated by Palmerston. What wasn't was the American Civil War. The Civil War itself doesn't really matter too much, though it does help to distract France and Britain, but what really matters is an interesting plan by Napoleon III to make use of the war and turn Mexico into a French satellite state. While the French didn't send that many soldiers, I can easily imagine that this is the time that Russia chooses to invade Poland again. And despite French and British objections, Prussia and Austria likely support this Russian action, having noticed the destabilizing effect that the Polish state had on their own Polish population. So, within a decade of the peace deal signed, Poland already disappears from the map again. But the real crisis has yet to begin. Otto von Bismarck was starting to lead Prussia towards the path of German unification. His efforts now would first see him wreck Denmark, but then it gets far more difficult. When Prussia historically went down the road of German unification, Europe didn't really care too much. Napoleon III considered Prussia small and harmless, and quite liked the idea of Austria getting dunked on. Russia itself was still bitter about Austria's betrayal in the Crimean War and was more focused on modernizing and attempting a round 2 against the Ottomans than intervening in the Brothers' War. That is all different in this time. Not only is Prussia bigger and therefore a more immediate threat for France, Russia absolutely cares about regaining their lost Baltic territories. This doesn't immediately mean that German unification is prevented. Bismarck is a talented diplomat. The most likely timeline I can think of, assuming Prussia still wants to go to war with Austria, is giving up the Baltic to buy Russian support for German unification. From here, Prussia and Italy still declare war on Austria. But while this is happening, Russia uses the opportunity of a major war between 3 great powers and launches their own war against the Ottomans. They wouldn't necessarily get far, but when both conflicts are over, Russia has restored their position on the Black Sea, while Prussia has formed the North German Confederation. Because Italy was already in control over Venice, the Austrian position in the south is weakened even more as they lose the defendable Alps. And this Austrian defeat may just spiral into something more interesting. Not only would the Hungarian crown demand more autonomy, there are an equal number of Romanians as Hungarians and Germans in this empire, with about 20% of the population being Romanian. Especially if Hungary does get special privileges, you can bet that a major Romanian revolt also takes place, which, in the worst case, could see Russian support, leading to the Austrians kicking most of Romania out of the empire to preserve stability. These series of defeats for Austria-Hungary have been substantial. They didn't come out of the Brothers' War pretty in our timeline, but now they have also lost control over their most major ports to Italy, while also losing the defendable and German majority parts of South Tyrol. In a worst case scenario, they have lost control over Romania entirely. In the best case, they have bought them off with a significant increase in autonomy. Even more so than in our timeline, it is difficult to think of Austria as a serious great power going forwards. But a timeline like this sees us, mostly, returning to a status quo like in our timeline, though with an even weaker Austria, a stronger Italy, and an angrier Russia. But there are more possibilities, obviously, and I can't run through them all. But if this is a scenario, assuming Prussia navigates diplomacy well, let's now imagine one where Austria does instead. It is quite possible that after the Crimean War, seeing the potential of a rising Prussia in the north, as well as the rising threat of Italy on Rome and the Austrian borderlands, leads to France and Austria growing closer together, becoming the bulwark against these new rising powers. Prussia, very likely, still gives up on their Baltic territories. It's just the logical thing to do, as Russian intervention would just secure the victory for Austria easily. But when the Prussians and Austrians gear up for war, and Russia announces their intention to invade the Ottomans at the same time, France mobilizes in favor of the Austrians. By this point, Prussia may recover if Italy and Prussia both give up territory to the French to buy their neutrality. This would then allow the Prussians to defeat Austria anyway, and might even get Italy on the side of Prussia against France later. But worst case scenario for the Prussians, France does actually support Austria. This would almost certainly cause a defeat for the Prussians. In this scenario, Russia still reverses their losses, having still gotten back all major territories lost in the Crimean War. Britain may prevent too heavy punishments on Italy and Prussia, but Venice and border territories to France would still be lost. Austria wouldn't demand too much from Prussia, but their hegemony over Germany is secured, as France takes major parts of the Rhine. Both Prussia and Italy's rise to great power status is prevented, while Russia has come back to the scene. By this point, Palmerston's vision for a better balanced Europe with a crippled Russia has been reversed, assuming either of these scenarios are realized, or most scenarios in between. By no means are these the only ways that this peace deal could have turned out, but, in my opinion, in by far most of the alternate timelines, Palmerston's goal of improving Europe's balance and keeping Russia down wouldn't be realized in the long term. But that's it for this video. Thank you all for watching, and consider leaving a like and a comment, as well as subscribing. If you enjoyed this video, click on the video on top to watch another one in this series. If you've already seen it, then I'm sure the bottom video is great too. Once again, thank you all for watching, and goodbye.